Today we're going to learn how to shim our 02 to 08 Honda CRF 450 valves. First, we're going to take off the seat by removing the bolts on each side of the bike by using a 10mm socket or a T-handle. Something to keep in mind throughout the rest of the video is to keep all the parts and hardware organized so that you don't get confused when reassembling. Slide the seat back so that it clears the front slot and remove it. Next, use an 8mm socket to remove the bolts securing the tank cover to the radiators. Make sure the fuel petcock is turned to the off position. Then, with the help of a pair of needle nose pliers, gently remove the fuel line from the petcock. Using an 8mm socket, remove the bolt securing the petcock to the frame. Use an 8mm socket to remove the bolts securing the right-hand tank cover. Using the 8mm socket, remove the remaining bolt securing the tank to the frame. Remove the clip which secures the rear of the tank to the frame. Then pull the fuel tank breather hose out of the steering stem. Carefully feed the petcock through the frame and remove the fuel tank from the bike. Gently pull up on the spark plug cap and move it to the side out of the way. Your bike should be equipped with a metal clamp. Mine happens to have a zip tie on it, so I'm using side cutters. Use a pair of needle nose pliers to slide the clamp off the fitting. Then, using a 10mm socket, remove the 3 bolts securing the cylinder head cover. Now we're going to remove the cylinder head cover from the engine. If your cover is excessively dirty, now is a good time to clean it so that no loose dirt or debris can fall into your engine. Slide the throttle cables and hot start cable out of the way so that they clear the cover. Carefully pull up on the cover and remove it from the engine. Use a 10mm Allen head socket to remove the crankshaft hole cap. Use an 8mm Allen head socket or a T-handle to rotate the crankshaft so that the punch mark on the crank gear comes into alignment with the mark on the right-hand cover. This will phase the crankshaft so that the piston is at top dead center. As you can see, this also aligns the slotted mark on the cam gear to the arrow on the cylinder head. Our cams are now positioned so that we can check clearance between them and the lifter buckets. By using a set of lash gauges, we can measure the amount of clearance between the cam and the bucket. The standard range for the intake cam is 6/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000th. I like to start with a thin lash gauge. Here I'm using 4/1000ths of an inch, and then I work my way up until I can no longer slide the gauge through. Once you find the right thickness, it should feel snug and just pass between the cam and bucket. Be careful not to force it through though, as you can push the lifter bucket down by doing this and get an inaccurate reading. Grab a piece of paper and a pencil so you can record all your measurements. I like to draw a diagram that represents the position of the 4 valves respective to the exhaust and intake side of the cylinder head to help keep track of each shim measured. As you can see here, I've recorded my measurement for the cam chain side intake valve. Now I'm going to measure my second intake valve using my lash gauges. As mentioned before, start with a thin gauge and work your way up until a lash gauge just slides through the cam and bucket and feels snug. Once you've found the right gauge, record your measurement for the second intake valve on your diagram. Continue the procedure for the exhaust valves. The standard range for the exhaust valves is 11/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000ths. Start thin. Here I'm using a 9/1000ths thick gauge and working my way up until the gauge feels snug between the shim and exhaust rocker arm. Record the measurement on your diagram. Measure and record your final exhaust valve clearance. Use a Phillips screwdriver or socket bit to remove the cam chain tensioner bolt. Next, you'll want to use your do-it-yourself cam chain tensioner tool. Feel free to pause the video and reference this frame, or use the provided instructions in your download to create your own cam chain tensioner tool. Now we'll take the tension off the cam chain by inserting the cam chain tensioner tool and using it like a screwdriver. The DIY tool can easily slip out of the slot, so I like to use a pair of pliers to help keep it positioned as I twist. Once you can no longer turn the tensioner any further with the tool, push the tool forward into the slot so that it stays in place. Next, we'll remove the cam gear. Use a 6mm Allen head socket to loosen the cam gear bolts, while simultaneously using an 8mm Allen head socket to keep the crankshaft from rotating. Once the first bolt is removed, rotate the crankshaft until the second bolt becomes easily accessible. Once you have removed both bolts, take great care not to unintentionally dislodge the gear off the camshaft, causing it to drop down into the engine. Carefully move the gear away from the cam, lower it slightly, and pull the chain off. Once you have the gear removed, take a zip tie or a piece of wire and secure the chain to the petcock bolt hole. If you happen to lose the chain, gear, or bolt down into the engine, use a pen magnet to pull them back up. Now we're going to remove the cam carrier. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the 4 cam carrier bolts evenly in a crisscross pattern. By using a crisscross pattern, the pressure on the mating surfaces of the carrier and cylinder head is relieved evenly, and the chances of any warping of the cam carrier is minimized. Once all the bolts are loosened, carefully take them out. The cam carrier is located to the head with a pair of dowel pins. Gently lift straight up on the carrier and wiggle it from the front to back if it doesn't pull up right away. Be careful not to apply too much lateral force as you pull up, because this will liken the chances of the dowel pin holes enlarging, making the fit more sloppy the next time around. As you remove the cam carrier, check to see if either of the lifter buckets have come out with the carrier. Label both of the lifter buckets and put them in their respective places on the diagram. The buckets are mated sliding parts and should not be interchanged, so it is important to keep track of them. Use a pen magnet to pull each shim away from its keeper, then take a Sharpie marker and label each shim according to its location on the diagram before setting it aside. What we need to do now is measure and record the thickness of each shim so that we can determine the size of the new shim that is required.